Okay, this is the story of Katara. Katara from Avatar The Last Airbender. So she's the one who says all that shit about, okay, water, earth, fire, air. A long time ago, the four nations lived together in harmony. Until one day that all changed. The Fire Nation attacked. Only the Avatar, the master of all four elements, could stop him. when the world needed him most, he vanished. Years passed, and me and my brother Sokka found Aang. I believe Aang can save the world. That's Katara, right? And she is the girl who finds Aang with her brother Sokka. He's frozen in an iceberg. She's like, she's curious. Sokka is kind of like, stay away from that. You could get hurt. They've already lost their mother, and their father was already fighting somewhere else. For all they know, he could be dead. But she was like, yeah, we have to see what the fuck's going on with this ice. And she goes up there and she like splits it open with like water bending that she like doesn't know how to use, but she knows she's a waterbender. Oh fuck, I should have started way from the beginning. Because I should have did it in chronology. It's fine. She cracked the ice open and then Aang emerged from the ice. And she was like, well, I never seen a guy like you. And he's like, well, I'm an airbender. You don't see the tattoos and everything else. He starts flexing his airbending, and then everybody's like, well, we like Aang. He's cool. He's playing with the penguins and other things. She wants Aang to stay there, and Sokka is kind of like, well, I think you'll bring trouble upon us, because the Fire Nation does, every once in a while come through and fuck with us. We don't have the manpower to fucking hold down against these fucking people if they come through. I'll have to defend this place with just me, essentially. And as what Sokka was saying, and then, Katara is like, still, he could help us out. He's the Avatar, and everybody knew it. And then Zuko showed up and was like, okay, let's take Aang. Aang, being who he is, was like, well, you can take me and leave these people alone. Katara was like, no, we gotta, save Aang and get him, right. Then Aang, end up leaving, escaping from Zuko, and then, they all came together and they said that they would help Aang find his way and master all four elements. So they go on their journey, and then they get to the temple, and Katara is there for Aang when he loses his fucking mind after seeing all the airbenders dead. When he really was the last one. She was like, you're here with me, and Sokka, we have you, we're your new family now, basically. And he was like, all right, sucky situation, but I have to live with that. And then they went on their journey. Eventually they found Zhang too. See, he's a firebender, right? Oh, well, before that, my bad. They found Kyoshi Island, and Katara's like, well, that was one of your past lives. You might be able to learn something here. They started to, talk with them, but then, Fire Nation attacked again in Zuko, and then, they were like, well, we have to, get out of here. They got out of there. Katara, well, they found Jet too. See, they found Jet. Jet ended up falling in love with Katara, or Katara fell in love with Jet. And they both had a thing for each other. Aang was a little bit jealous, but Jet was a guy who was kind of pulling on Katara's heartstrings. See, Katara lost her mom. I'll just talk about it right now. See, I forgot to tell y'all this at the beginning. About like a couple years or so before this like journey started, the firebenders did a raid on the Southern Water Tribe. They had believed that Aang had died at sea, and then they were like, well, the next avatar could be born here, a waterbender. And they had been performing raids in the Water Tribe for years, because they knew that, if Aang did manage to die, since they knew all the airbenders were dead, if he was alive, he was the last one. But they went to the Southern Water Tribe to attack and Katara's mother, knowing that Katara was the only waterbender down there in the Southern Water Tribe, she said, well, I'm the waterbender. And then they killed her right in front of her, and she has those memories and everything else. But like they kind of connected over that fucked up type of trauma because Jet lost his family to the firebenders too. And then like Katara was like, oh my god, Jet, you're cool, and all this other shit. She fell in love with it for a little bit. But then Aang, enlightened them both. You're fucking around with, like the people you're trying to protect, you're taking from them so that you can then protect them. But in taking from them, you're actually like making their lives worse. And then, Katara snapped out of it and was like, well, Aang's usually right, and I actually like Aang. So, so she came back, to her senses, and then, and then, Jet was like just for a loss. He lost a girl and other things. But then Jong appeared for Aang and taught Aang Firebender. Katara was like, well, damn, Aang, I see what you're doing. It looks cool, but, we have to do this. And he was like, wait. And he tried to show her a move, and then he ended up burning her. Katara was, upset and, started crying because that's fucking hot fire. She didn't think that Aang wouldn't have control of it. And then after that, he was like, I'll never firebend again because I hurt, the girl, Katara. Katara ended up finding some waterbending scrolls somewhere. I don't remember how, but she found him. Sokka, of all people, helped Haru and the Earthbenders, get right. And Katara was there to help too, and Aang was to defeat, the firebenders who were fucking playing games. But then they went to Omashu, she was, crystallized, and Aang had to fight against Bumi, who he didn't know was Bumi, and then he found out it was Bumi, and he was like, okay, it makes sense. And then they left, and they went to the Northern Water Tribe. In the Northern Water Tribe, well, actually, Katara and Sokka got sick first, and then when Katara and Sokka got sick, when Katara and Sokka got sick, god damn it, Aang had to go find, some help. It was because Bai was playing games in the spirit world, and then he had to talk to Roku, and also he got kidnapped by Zhao as well, and then, they got their treatment from Aang eventually, and then they went on their way, and eventually they got to the Northern Water Tribe, and Katara was excited not just for Aang but herself. She wanted to learn waterbending better. However, when they got there, Katara was told to be a healer because in the Northern Water Tribe they were more sophisticated or whatever, and they had a certain guidelines for waterbenders. Men were warriors and girls were not. They had to learn healing techniques, and then men who could waterbend were doing that, and then the other ones were like a Akota, and they went out and they used spears and swords and all kind of shit to hold down for the Northern Water Tribe. She was like, well, I don't like that, I'll have to, to fucking flex on you or something, learn waterbending. She learned a little bit of moves from Master Paku, and then eventually, some things happened with that. And then she saw Aang do his thing and protect people from that. And, she felt bad for her brother because he lost Uwe, the girl who sacrificed her life to save the moon spirit. And she went up to the sky and became the moon. But they then went to the Earth Kingdom. And in the Earth Kingdom, the general was like, we need to see him go into the Avatar state right now. We can't fucking wait. He was not being indecisive. He was like, we need to attack now. I want to see what you can do in your to the fullest extent. And Aang was like, well, I can't do it. And then he was like, I'll make you do it. He put Katara underground. Katara was like basically almost dead. She went underground. He put her in the fucking ground. And then Aang went into the Avatar state and showed that, and then brought her back up. Then they went on to I'm trying to remember. Zuko had a falling out with his family and shit, or like his people and stuff. She was like, "We gotta find you an earthbending master and shit." I could tell I said that. I'm trying. I'll try to get to that part. Hold on, man. They go back towards Omashu. I remember that. They go back towards Omashu. And when they go back towards Omashu, they come to find out that... Oh, fuck. Hold on. Wait a minute. No. They didn't go towards Omashu yet. Hold on. Let me backtrack a little bit. Okay, they went to the swamp, right? They got to the swamp, people. And in the swamp, they find these guys who... they know how to, like, water bend the fucking... water in the vines. And Katara found that out. She started cutting through the fucking vines with the water, and she's like, "Hold on, I see a guy in there. What the fuck's going on?" And she saw them, and then they like, "Well, we are waterbenders. We're by you, waterbenders." We saw that bison in that little flying monkey thingy, and we were gonna eat her, but we know that you people are cool, so we ain't gonna eat your pets or whatever, and then Katara was like, okay, well, new kind of waterbenders and a creative way of using your waterbending. She learned something as a waterbender. That it was kind of interesting to her. But then they went and they did the Omashu thing after that. Oh, no, they found Toph first. God damn it. Right? No, they went to Omashu. They went to Omashu after that. And Omashu was under siege from, goddamn, Azula. The Prime Minister's son, who was a firebender, the Prime Minister of the Fire Nation, a diplomat or whatever, had a son, and then they like had to take the son back. That was Aang doing all that shit. But she had to walk through the town like she was sick, with Sokka and everybody else to like scare the firebenders. But after that happened, they found Toph. Toph was doing whatever, and they were like, well, she's like, hey, if you can't have her as the earthbending teacher, we'll have to find somewhere else. And he was like, well, I think she needs to be my earthbending teacher. And he stayed, and he helped her out. Then she went with them. After that, they were kind of on the run from Azula and shit, but they were all like up all night, so they were all fucking mad at each other. They ended up splitting up for a little bit. But then they found each other again, and they were like, okay, let's not fight. Let's just, not fuck around like that. Aang actually, led them away. And then Katara and everybody else, Zuko and everybody was fighting against Azula. They backed her into a corner and got rid of her, or they thought they did. They ended up going into the desert afterwards. And they started running through the desert and shit. And they found an oasis place where they found the place that Zhao had a map, or he got the knowledge of the moon spirit from a library, Wang Xing's library. See, Wang Xing's an owl, and he runs a place in the spirit world called Wang Xing's library, and he kept all the knowledge of like the spirit world and the physical world in that library. And it was from it being there, and also people bringing shit to him, and when they went into the fucking place, Katara handed over certain waterbending scrolls, and he was like, well, I can add that to my collection, and you can go everywhere except certain places. Sokka found the place he wasn't supposed to go, and they were like, she was like, no, you can't be here. I knew I shouldn't have let you in here. The Avatar was actually young and other things. I knew he was going to play games, so, I'll sink this place. But as the place was sinking, Toph had, a decision to make. She had to, either save them or save Appa. Appa was getting rounded up by sand benders to, get him and, sell him off to somebody. And then Aang got upset, and then Katara was there to calm him down, because that was his best friend and shit. Before he had all of them, he had Appa always. So then his pet was gone, and he was pissed. But he helped they helped some, people get to Ba Sing Se who were going to have a kid. And the baby's name was Hope, and then Katara helped with the birth and other things. Katara was then there in Ba Sing Se. She helped Toph, learn how to be a little more feminine and other things, because she's a girl who likes to be dumb and try to act like a guy. But, she's a younger girl and stuff. So that happened. But did you know that after that, Katara, and them wanted to see a meeting with Earth King, and then, figure out, how they could defeat the Fire Nation. Katara and Sokka got word that their father was somewhere out there, and that, they could see him again, real soon. But then things went awry when they found out that, goddamn, the Dali agents were there. Oh, but before that, god damn it, Jet showed up again, and he was brainwashed, and he had to fight against Aang, and then, he died in Katara's arms. Katara was kind of sad, even though she didn't like him anymore. She still understood his pain and all that extra shit. But she, or he went down into Zuko and Katara got imprisoned together down in the diamond mine area of Ba Sing Se, because of Azula taking over, from Long Fang and other things, and the Dali agents were under her, command at that point. She did that strategically and everything else. It was a big move for the Fire Nation. Then Aang showed up again and was like, well, I have to protect Katara. He was learning about chakra pools and how to, essentially achieve, true enlightenment and become, the Avatar and use the full extent of his, Avatar state. But then he had to leave and he was like, I can't do that shit. But then, he was like, during the fight, Zuko was fighting against Katara. Katara was about to heal Zuko's wound and keep that spiritual water to heal his wound, and she almost did. But then that would come into play later when they were fighting, and then Aang was like, fuck this, I'll go in and hit my chakra pools. And then and then Azula stabbed and shot him in the back, and he, fell to his death almost. But thankfully for Katara's healing water, he came to, but it took a while. It took him 3 months. He had hair at that point. And then Katara was like, yeah, we took a Fire Nation ship and we're, trying to fly around. And then he was like, I'm going to let them know I'm still around and shit, But then they invaded the Fire Nation again, and they found a Fire Nation colony. They taught people how to dance, and, Katara got to dance with Aang. And then she became the Painted Lady. See, the Painted Lady was some lore of some Fire Nation place. But they were sitting near this, factory or this, fucking place that had, it was kind of like Udon Prison or Udon area in One Piece, where all the waste would feed into the water and then everything got polluted. They had no fresh fish or anything. So Katara would try to bring them food every once in a while as the Painted Lady. But then they were like, the Painted Lady don't exist and other things. And then she was like, she had to help them out, Aang and everybody, even Katara, she held down against those people who were running that, facility or whatever and dumping, waste into the water. But after that, they cleaned up the water. She was part of that cleanup crew, cleaning up the water and making shit cool for everybody to drink, and eat and be right. And then after that here's the part where you guys wanted to know some stuff. Okay, so they get to a house out in the Fire Nation outskirts. And there's an old woman there, and her name's Hama. She's cracked out old lady and stuff. They're like, she kind of is like, I'm kind of lonely, and it's been a while since I've had people around, and they're like, okay, Hama, we can stay with you, and then she was like, I didn't know there was any more waterbenders left. I used to be from the Southern Water Tribe too. They started looking through her shit and they found a comb, and he was like, well, this comb could be something, or, because Sokka was the one who was kind of skeptical a little bit. Hama, an old woman living out here by herself. And then they heard rumors about somebody who was taking people down to the cave, and then these people never returning. Hama ended up teaching Katara like basically the full extent of waterbending. She hadn't even scratched the surface yet. But a couple of weeks ago, Katara had learned a form of waterbending. Zuko had sent a combustion man after her, and then Toph was playing games, and she got arrested. And then Katara was like, "I'm going to do something bad too. I'll get arrested too, because people think I'm not so fun." And then she helped Toph escape. Her and Toph escape because she ran really fast and she used a sweat to create waterbending. Use water, the liquid to use it. But then Hama went and said, you can take it even further and said, you can pull it out of, living creatures, or not creatures, but organisms like plants and shit. And then she also pulled it from thin air, and it turned it to ice and shit. She was like, but this ain't even the full extent of your powers and shit. At midnight, or not at midnight, on a full moon, that's when that's when you can perform bloodbending acts, and she performed bloodbending acts on Katara and Aang and Sokka, and she was like, "This is your birthright, Katara. You have to do this. You'll complete my work for it." She's like, "You'll complete my work. You'll become a bloodbender just like me. I don't care about this or that. They tried to wipe us out, Katara. You have to understand. She was gonna kill Aang and Sokka." But then she had to perform bloodbending. She didn't want to perform it ever again, though. However, come time for the Day of Black Sun, and she had to, help create a bed for Aang so he can get his sleep in and be all right. The Day of Black Sun comes, and then they're fighting alongside their brother, or not their brother, their father. Sokka and Katara are fighting against the Fire Nation with their father, who they liked, but Katara kind of was like, where were you when mom died, and she had her problems with him, but she still cared about her father, and then they took that shit down and held that shit down, but things took a turn for the worse when the Day of Black Sun didn't go in their favor. They knew it was going to come. Zuko found his father and, did some things. Aang found Azula and tried to, but, things didn't work out. All the men had to stay back and they became, war prisoners. And then they went to the Southern Air Temples. Eventually, Zuko came out there and was like, I want to join your crew. But then Katara was the one who was definitely like, no, because you tried to tell me in the cave that you were going to change and you didn't. Why would you change now, all of a sudden? And he's like, well, this and that and this and that. And he helped him defeat Contraband. But she wasn't convinced. She was like, all right, fine. Come with me on this mission. I'm going to find the guy who, killed my mother. And he was like, okay, well, I'll do that. She ended up, using some kind of bloodbending and shit, and Zuko witnessed it, and he was like, she was like, I can do that shit to you if I ever, sense that you're gonna do something to Aang. He's like, yeah. They ended up finding the guy, but she didn't want to take revenge out because she didn't want to become like Hama. See, Katara was a little more wise than Hama was as far as, yeah, that guy did do some stuff, but the way he was living, he was still living with his mother at an old age. That's a shitty existence. He's, scared. He's living with his mother, and he's like, that's not a life I would say is, amazing. He can live this worthless ass life and rot away, because, sometimes, that's worse than, killing somebody, and then that's what she did, and then she left, and then, she told Zuko that, and then, eventually they went to Ember Island because Azula tried to attack, but then they left, and they got to Ember Island, and they saw a play, and Katara was like, okay, this is happening, and this is happening, and then Aang got, he left, and they were like, where's Aang? They had to, hold down against the Fire Nation a little bit, without Aang. And then Aang showed up to fight Ozai, and then everything was taken care of. He took his bending away, and then the world was saved finally after 100 years. It finally, was over. Mm-hmm. And then Katara and Aang, got together, they hooked up and had kids. And that was, what it was. And then she was in the Legend of Korra as an old woman. She was there for the next Avatar. She says, Aang would have wanted you to, do this and do that. She was there as kind of a, mentor type, She kind of looked like her grandmother, honestly. When I saw her again, I was like, oh, she looks just like her grandmother. And then, she just lived her life as an old woman and eventually, met Aang afterwards, I guess, But that's the story of Katara and, as it's told by me, Darius the Green Angel. She was a great waterbender. She helped Aang, then she made love with Aang and had kids, who were, also, great teachers to the next Avatar, who was Korra. But Katara is one of the greatest waterbenders. I'll have to make a video about that eventually. But be cool calling the corner. And if you're of water signage, try not to, be too deep sometimes. But, I know you can't help it.